Afternoon and welcome to this International Crisis Group event. My name is Marguerite Clary and I'm the Senior Communications and Advocacy Officer for Crisis Group's Asia program. For those of you that are less familiar with Crisis Group, we're a policy-oriented advocacy organization dedicated to conflict prevention and resolution. Here in Asia, we're a team of 15 covering 10 country situations, as well as broader regional dynamics. I'm delighted to moderate today's discussion on what may prove to be a defining moment for Bangladesh. As many of you will know, it has been 4 days since the country went to the polls in a historic election, the first credible vote in 17 years. The vote marked the culmination of a student-led popular uprising that ousted Sheikh Hasina after nearly 2 decades in power, in a period that had grown increasingly autocratic. Across Bangladesh, nearly 60% of the country's more than 127 million eligible voters cast their ballots, with the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, or BP, securing over 2/3 of seats. Bangladeshis also voted resoundingly in favor of the July Charter, a reform roadmap negotiated over the past year to help prevent a return to autocratic rule. But the real test begins now. Bangladesh faces significant political, economic, and institutional challenges in the months ahead. Joining me to discuss what comes next are Sarah Hussain, who's a lawyer or advocate at the Supreme Court of Bangladesh, Mubashir Hassan, who's an adjunct researcher at the Humanitarian and Development Research Initiative at Western Sydney University, and Thomas Keane, who's Crisis Group Senior Consultant on Myanmar and Bangladesh. We'll start with a 50-minute moderated discussion with the panelists, and then we'll open for Q&A. If you'd like to ask questions throughout the discussion, please type them into the Q&A box, and please state your name and affiliation. I want to let everyone know that the call will be with no further ado. Tom, I'd like to begin with you. To set the scene, what is the mood like on the ground in Dhaka? And how should we understand where Bangladesh finds itself politically after these elections? And what are the main political dynamics that will shape Bangladesh over the next few years?
Yeah, thanks, Marguerite. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thanks, everyone, for joining as well. So this election was a critical test for Bangladesh for the past 18 months, as you said. Since Sheikh Hasina fled the country in August 2024. It's been under an interim government led by Professor Muhammad Yunus. And it was important for the country to transition to an elected government under the constitution. Bangladesh has also not held a credible election for 17 years. So this was a really important moment. And just at the top, I would say overall, it went, pretty smoothly. And dare I say it, better than we had perhaps expected, or not as challenging as we had feared. There were a number of ways in which it could have gone wrong. So far it seems that the political parties, the interim government, other key institutional actors like the army have managed to navigate this sort of tricky moment. In terms of the outcome of the election, the BNP, as you mentioned, won a large majority with over 200 seats in the 300-seat parliament. 300 elected seats in the parliament. Next was Jamaat Islami and its allies, which won 77 seats, so around a quarter. That also includes 6 seats for the student party, NCP, which had an election. As close when it received around 12%. Apologies. Can you hear me? Hello?
We can.
Okay, thank you. It just dropped out. So regarding the mood on the ground, it was really a privilege to be in Dhaka for this election. because, for the most part, there was a great atmosphere. Went to half a dozen polling stations, spoke to dozens of voters, staff at the polling stations, and party agents as well. People seemed, genuinely happy to have the chance to vote after so long, and that they could vote without fear or safety concerns. I know the term festive has been thrown around a lot, but it did really have that feel in the areas that I visited. I was at one polling station set up in a college, and it had a large open space between the buildings where the voting was taking place. It was like a field, and both before and after voting, people were hanging around, taking photos, enjoying the atmosphere. They were dressed up. Security, were there trying to move them on so it didn't get too crowded in the polling station. But they weren't having much luck with that. People were pretty determined to make them, to have fun, to enjoy the day. Many people have commented that it was a bit like the Eid festival in Bangladesh. It had that kind of feel. And people I spoke to also expressed quite a bit of optimism for the future, and they had mostly praise for the interim government. So I think that also contributed to this kind of atmosphere. Of course, this is just a snapshot from Dhaka. But it looks like, it was largely reflected across the country. There was relatively little violence if we compare to past elections. There were some reports of irregularities, but again, not a huge number, and not some of the issues that we've seen in the past. It was more subtle than overt irregularities, I think. The losing parties, and this is probably the most important aspect in some ways, losing parties have also accepted the outcome, which was a real test as well. They are demanding recounts in some seats, but it won't change the overall outcome. There is still an element of uncertainty, I think, at the moment. This is a transition right now, with the interim government under Professor Yunus yet to formally hand over to the new government. That's expected to happen tomorrow, I think. And, I suppose in a transition period, everyone's a little nervous until that is formally completed. And in the last few days, there have been some reports of attacks and, post-election violence. And of course, these are unfortunate, but compared to what we've seen in the past, doesn't seem to be at the same level. Some of these still need to be verified, so we don't yet have a completely accurate picture. So as I mentioned, the next government should be sworn in imminently. Tariq Rahman, the leader of the BNP, will become the next prime minister. His mother was, of course, a two-time prime minister. And his father was also leader of the country. The BNP is seen as more of an establishment party. Traditionally, power kind of moved back and forth between the BNP and the Awami League. And so I think this was a vote for stability, and I think it reflects sort of greater confidence in the BNP to manage the economy. And of course, many people potentially voted for the BNP as they were concerned about an Islamist party forming government and what that might mean for national identity and secularism in Bangladesh and so on. And the BNP may have picked up votes from supporters of the Awami League. These are things that we don't know. We don't have great data exactly, but I think there's a feeling that it probably did better in terms of attracting Awami League voters, which is probably not surprising. Now, this was not just an election, it was also a referendum on the July Charter, as you mentioned, Marguerite, a framework for political reforms that was negotiated between the political parties over the past year. And the yes vote won with around 68%. Although some Awami League supporters did boycott the election, we can see that from the turnout, I think, which was around 60%, just under. I think the turnout overall was still strong, and there was strong support for the yes vote. And I think this broadly reflects the credibility of the election and the support for reform among most Bangladeshis, who are looking for change. So overall, I think the outcome of the election was mostly positive for Bangladesh up to this point. But it's not going to be all smooth sailing from here, far from it. The BNP does have a large majority, as I said, but Jamaat and the NCP also have a strong platform to hold the government accountable. And the BNP will face, several significant challenges, including the economy and security. There's also, many people tell me about the natural anti-incumbency in Bangladesh. And I think people now also have higher expectations of their governments. So it's going to be hard for the BNP to meet expectations. And there are also still a lot of disagreements over the July Charter reforms that I mentioned earlier. I see it as kind of the last few months has been a little bit of a ceasefire on the July Charter, but once a new government is in power and attention turns back to those reforms, I think we can see, well, we'll see more divisions emerging between BNP and Jamaat and NCP on the other side. We'll probably, use this issue to mobilize and to also to negotiate. So we'll see how that unfolds in the next 6 months. But yeah, that's a sort of summary of how the past few days have unfolded in Bangladesh.
Thanks very much, Tom. On that note, I'd like to turn to you, Mubashir. Some people question whether Bangladesh has lived up to the aspirations of the July protest movement and whether the election of the BNP amounts to simply reverting back to business as usual politics. Do you agree with these critics? And what has really changed in Bangladesh?
I'm somewhere in the middle. So I kind of reject the proposition that there is something called July aspiration, which was defined. That was not, because I was part of that aspiration. To give you a bit of context, I was living in exile during Sheikh Hasina's period because I am a survivor of enforced disappearance, and I was forced to leave the country, and I was participating in the July aspiration, quote unquote, from my capacity from here in Australia. That includes contributing to narrating what is happening in Bangladesh under Sheikh Hasina's government, to international media, writing op-eds, and contributing to policy discussions organized across the world by the government and non-government organizations who are interested in Bangladesh. So but what happened after the July is that we see a group of people are talking about aspiration. To me, the aspiration was simply to topple or at least move Bangladesh back to democracy from an authoritarian government that was ruling the country over 15 years and with total impunity to law enforcement agencies and intelligence agencies who were very much part of this system. So that was the July aspiration for me. But having said that, I think it was really great to see ordinary Bangladeshis was able to put their opinion in terms of electing their representative. It's very nominal here in Australia. We don't really appreciate the significance of this nominal democratic practice that an individual citizen could represent someone, and that little nominal democratic aspiration and practice was totally broken down under Sheikh Hasina's government. As we have seen, police and intelligence agencies were stuffing ballots in favor of Sheikh Hasina. So I would say that, yes, that election is a sharp breakaway point from that 17 years of practice that did not acknowledge people's basic democratic dignity and rights of voting. So that's number one. That's a huge difference. Number two, I do not think it's a business as usual proposition that BNP came into power. I mean, what is not business as usual is that we also need to, while we criticize BNP as a big party, I know, and they do not have a clean record as well, but also the party leaders, including its top leader, went through a journey in the past 17 years. I mean, if we talk about Tariq Rahman, there are a lot of criticism about him, but also it is a fact that he was a survivor of torture in the hand of military. He was forced into exile to London, and also his speeches were banned from broadcasting in Bangladesh. I give you an example. I wrote a chapter, I published a book which is called Narrative of Bangladesh, and there was one chapter on Tariq Rahman, and Rapid Action Battalion members came to my home when the DJFI forcefully disappeared me. They took that book that was printed, not being printed from the press, but the draft, and told my dad, your son wrote a chapter on Tariq Rahman. And what was the chapter? There was an op-ed on Daily Star about the liberal politician Tariq Rahman. So we have to appreciate that everyone and a lot of people, including from BNP, went through a big journey of negotiating to survive under Hasina's government. There are hundreds and millions, hundreds of cases against fake cases against BNP, but not only BNP, General Kidik and so forth. So I do not, I see it a bit bigger than business as usual, but also with the 2/3 majority, BNP now have a lot of responsibility, and that is that there they need to play a responsible role. And we do not have much option at the moment. We have Jamaat Islami, who is a party, formed, who is a party who formed under the ideology of Maulana Maududi, who believed that there should be a perennial conflict between Islam and West, and Islam will win. That party, who is coming into the major opposition, even though they have moderated their views from Maududi and kind of contextualized their practices, but we have seen they have limitation about women rights. We have seen that they have limitation about the rights of the minority. I think we are going to have a very interesting next 5 years. Nothing is confirmed in Bangladesh, but I would hope that this government would sustain 5 more years. And then we'll see how it plays out. In terms of the Awami League question, I do believe that hundreds and thousands of people are associated and at least supporters of Awami League, and those who did not commit crime against humanity and who did not participate in Sheikh Hasina's multi-million-dollar corruption project or didn't participate in the repressive behavior, they are still Bangladeshi citizen. They are holding Bangladeshi passport. By that they are entitled to enjoy every right a citizen should enjoy in Bangladesh. So I think the next government should come up. Obviously, it needs to be discussed in the parliament, but there should be some sort of avenue to give them political expression, even if they do not want to give the name Awami League because there is a fear that the Sheikh family may come back through this. There's some way you need to move towards reconciliation because it doesn't work otherwise. I will finish with a comment on July Charter and an observation what I've seen in Bangladesh. To give you a bit of background, I spent around a month in December and January in Bangladesh. So I want to share one of my observation about this. So, we talk about July Charter. We talk about the to put limit to the absolute power and those things, which are really good and fine. But to me, as a survivor and as a researcher of authoritarianism, I feel that July Charter falls short of addressing the elephant in the room, which is a reform in the Bangladeshi intelligence agency and law enforcement agencies, who were integral part of Sheikh Hasina's project of violating human rights, which include enforced disappearance, running a chain of secret prison across the country, and even even intervening individual life, like, threatening academics, threatening journalists. You don't see it in a normal country. You heard of this sort of intervention in countries like, I don't know, maybe Soviet Union, or I have read some of the stuff about Nazi Germany, where Gestapo was really into some people's life. And if you go and talk to editors or journalists now in Bangladesh, many of them actually have faced severe sort of interference in their personal lives from these intelligence agencies. And then this July Charter doesn't even address this. So if you have that structure in place and you talk about reform, the reform the system so that the Bangladesh doesn't go back to authoritarianism, I'm really quite puzzled here that what reform we are actually talking about. Maybe Sarah Paizia, she could highlight on that note if she wants to. And the final point I wanted to say, what I've seen in Bangladesh, that repression is still going on in different level. I've seen, and I've wrote an article in the Diplomat magazine about it. There are Awami League perceived Awami League sympathizers who are academics, journalists, who were not formally charged for any crime. I heard that, at least I've talked to two of them, that their bank accounts were freeze. There is unofficial embargo on them to go outside of Bangladesh, which I faced during Sheikh Hasina's period. I had to have a special green signal from DGFI, the military intelligence, through police, that whether they would allow me to go back to the country. Not only me, Shohidul Alam, many journalists, many critics at that time had to go through this extra psychological repression. And here again, we talk about spirit of July, aspiration of July, the charter of July, but we are seeing same level of behavior coming. I mean, if anyone commit crime, you charge them. That's the rule of law. That's the democracy we know. But if no one is charged, but you put them under psychological repression, that some of their salary account are freeze, some of their savings account, there are people I heard that their savings account were freeze, that this unofficial embargo, one of them want to go abroad to do PhD, but they can't because they said they would not be allowed to go, but they were not even charged. So I feel that behavior goes back to what is July, against the spirit of July. And that is quite prevalent at the moment. Even the intensity is less. Yes, I'm not the target. Yes, most of the people are not the target, but still there are people, they're facing target. And this is the same establishment. So if we talk about reform and other things, but we do not address the elephant in the room, I would be very skeptic about Bangladesh's transition. Thank you.
Thank you, Mubashir. You've raised some really important points that I hope we'll be able to return to later in the conversation. For now, I'd like to return to the question of Jamaat. And Sarah, I'd like to ask you, so we saw Jamaat Islami record its strongest ever performance in this election, although it didn't win. Why do you think it gained so much or so many supporters over the past 18 months? And what does Jamaat's growing influence mean for the country in the years ahead?
Yeah, thanks very much for the question. I mean, I guess a couple of small caveats at the start. I mean, one question is how much did they actually gain and how much did their allies gain? Because they were, of course, in an alliance with the National Citizens Party, which was the party formed by students. If you remember, many of the leaders of the National Citizens Party left that party when it formed the alliance with the Jamaat, but that still leaves the possibility that many young people and people who saw the NCP as being among the leaders of the July uprising voted for that alliance for that reason. So I guess that's one thing we need to look at, the kind of try and see if we can figure out the disaggregation of the vote. And I think another thing which maybe connects with what Mubashir was saying is I wonder whether they would have gained so much if the election had been fully inclusive and if Awami League had also been running. For example, I've seen some people, former Awami League MPs, posting messages saying that they've heard from their supporters and members on the ground that in some areas Awami Leaguers voted for Jamaat because they felt they were more they saw BNP as their more natural opposition and also had faced some harassment at the hands of the BNP in the last 15 months during the IG. So I guess those are two caveats. But I think amongst the reasons that they managed to increase their vote share, one is probably, again, we need the data. We don't have a lot of data to be able to, substantiate our assumptions and analysis here. So one may be that there's a much younger demographic that voted for them. We need to see if that's actually the case. And if that is, that would at least make some sense in that, anyone younger than about 30 doesn't necessarily remember the Jamaat in office. The Jamaat has sold itself as being the alternative, saying you've seen BNP, you've seen BAL, you haven't seen us in office. This is actually a complete lie because they have been in office with BNP in alliance in the 90s and again more recently in 2001. But of course, if you're under 30, you won't have experienced that, you won't have memories. For those of us who have memories, we really don't need to be told what a new Jamaat will be because we know what the old Jamaat was and what it did. But I think the second reason would be, so this generation hasn't seen them in action in that way. They haven't also seen them out of office in action. So for older, an older generation, we've seen the Jamaat in the ascendant, in civil society, in university campuses, where again, they've had a very documentedly violent history. So for people who grew up in the last 15, 16 years, they haven't seen that because during that period, Jamaat was on the run and faced, incredible repression themselves under the Army League as well. So they couldn't, mete it out to others. And of course, the history of 71 is very important. So for older people, anyone who experienced the Liberation War and the genocide of 71 or its aftermath, or has grown up with that history and that experience, it's unconscionable to even imagine that you could possibly vote for Jamaat. I think given serious allegations against many of their members, not only of collaboration with the Pakistan Army, but of involvement in war crimes and other atrocities. Now, of course, there are issues about those who were tried, convicted and executed for war crimes under the previous government, under the Army League government. There are many questions around those trials and their fairness and that entire process having been politically motivated and manipulated. But that doesn't still remove the issue about war crimes having been committed and someone having been responsible. And if not, these people, if they didn't have fair trials, that still doesn't completely obviate the issue about whether there was responsibility or not. But that whole debate seems irrelevant to many younger people. They feel that is not for them to sort out. This was past history and they don't want to address it. And Jamaat has gained from pushing that argument as well. And I think two other sort of more positive reasons for why they've managed to get this traction. One is that they've had a very strong ground game, I think, and they've been preparing for this election long before everybody else, it seems. I mean, I saw Jamaat activists on the streets very soon, within months of 2 months, I think, of the uprising in 24, going house to house, wandering around bazaars, leafleting and so on. They've been very prepared. They have a very organized structure and they've deployed it to the max. And I think another point that's important is about the way in which they have done a kind of like community-based, welfarist kind of approach in terms of their politics. We've seen, again, in the aftermath of the uprising, where there were so many, thousands of victims all across the country who'd faced these horrendous injuries when they'd been fired upon during the protests, with children, young people with pellets all over their bodies and their faces. Many Jamaat members did go house to house, did try and provide support and provided financial aid. Other parties also did that, but certainly reports I've received on the ground, Jamaat gave much larger amounts and gave it more consistently to many people. So I think they also, gained a lot from that kind of activism. But as for your question about where do we go from here? One last crucial and not so positive point, I think, is that Jamaat also had a very sophisticated and very expansive social media operation. I mean, let's just be frank and say massive disinformation and misinformation campaign, which ran online, where they talked up their own potential success and activities, but they also massively attacked opponents. And I think that also, we'll have to wait for some more analysis, but I think that's another hunch for why they were able to up their vote share. Now, what does their growing influence mean for us going ahead? Well, the first thing, the fact they didn't win means a lot for us, I think. You'll have seen a lot of celebrations, a lot of actions. The day after the election was the beginning of spring, and that's a big cultural festival in this part of the world. You saw a lot of celebrations which are about, thank God they're out, they didn't make it, and everyone in their yellow saris and yellow clothes celebrating that. I think, and it was also Valentine's Day, so there were many memes about people saying, thank God we don't have to shut down Valentine's Day because these guys aren't coming in. And historically, they fought that, just as we've seen in India, the BJP fight Valentine's Day. I don't know why these people are against love, but I think maybe that tells us everything we need to know about them. But I think more seriously, though, I think their growing influence means certainly we'll see it almost immediately now with the discussions that are going to open in the new parliament. I think there's going to be a very full frontal head-on destruction of the structures we've had, institutional and more importantly, constitutional commitment that we've had to secularism. I mean, that has been something they very clearly flagged over the last 15 months. And not only, and secularism, the argument about secularism that has been used to try and sort of undermine it is say, well, it's an anti-religious approach. I think it's very clear secularism is not about being anti-religion, it's simply separating, state sponsorship of one religion. But secularism, as it's understood in Bangladesh, and as it was intended, was about respect for all religions and all beliefs. Equal respect, not putting one above the other. Jamaat's position is very clear, Islam über alles. That is very clear for them. And they've said that repeatedly. That's part of their manifesto. They've said, Islamic scripture and so on will also override the constitution, even though they're now going to be engaged in processes about constitutional reforms. That's the first thing we're going to face. They're also very clear. I mean, our constitutional definition of secularism goes alongside a commitment to being anti-communal. So that is basically being non-sectarian against different communities, having respect for all communities, not only but belief. So I think that will go along with an attack on that. And certainly what we've seen in these past months, I think we're going to see more of it, is heightened misogyny and efforts to exclude women from public life and restrict women's rights in the private sphere as well. Again, if the Jamaat is saying they're committed to Sharia, if not immediately, gradually, that means they're basically committing themselves to reducing women's rights in private life. They've already said very openly and publicly, Jamaat women members have said, we don't need to have leadership roles. Men are our directors, and men can direct our decision making. We don't need that. I think for most women in Bangladesh, in over 54 years, we've seen massive strides forward. It's not just 2 women prime ministers. We've seen huge strides forward where women have entered the labor force, higher rates in education, primary upwards. I don't think women are ready to roll all of that back, and certainly not at the request of the Jamaat. So maybe the most, in a way, both negative and positive outcome is going to be, I think for many women now who've not been active in politics, it's not going to be that we all want to run and be candidates for office. It's depressing to see many phenomenal candidates did not make it, women candidates, but I hope they'll stay the course. And I think for many other women, it will mean that we'll be much more committed, many more women will be much more committed to political mobilization to counter the Jamaat on the ground and in social spaces, political and cultural spaces. So I think that's, in a way, that's a silver lining of this situation, that people will feel that political mobilization is necessary and not only possible, but absolutely necessary and critical as we go forward.
Thank you, Sarah. That's particularly interesting. And again, I hope we'll return to that topic as well. Mubashir, I would like to ask you for now about Bangladesh's foreign relations, particularly with India, and how you think the new government is likely to recalibrate their approach against the backdrop of Sheikh Hasina's exile and heightened public sensitivities about sovereignty and influence. And potentially, if you would like to add, you did already touch on it, but how this ties to how the BNP government should handle the question of the Awami League.
So I think this recalibration needs to be mutual. It is quite heightened in India too. I have been participating in talk shows in Indian TVs, and I would suggest anyone here to join there. It is quite heated, it is quite emotional, and it is quite discriminatory in the sense that there was highly partisan views about Bangladesh in there. So I would obviously think that the things will be much more stable under BNP's leadership. So far, what we have gathered from the public speeches of Tariq Rahman and other leaders who talked about Bangladesh's potential foreign relation with India is that they would put Bangladesh's national interests first. Whereas there is a sharp breakaway from what we perceived, or many analysts perceived, Sheikh Hasina's foreign policy, where India probably was given special preference there. By that we mean there are deals which were signed that favor India, including transshipment movement, and there were much more military intelligence sharing between two countries. There were relationship which mimic India's foreign policy towards Pakistan when it comes about Bangladesh-Pakistan relationship. And the list goes on. So I think there would be reversal, at least even if it is not reversal, it says there will be sharp breakaway from that potential India favored foreign policy. India favored in the sense that many people perceived Sheikh Hasina as being India's quote unquote poodle. But geography also matters, and geography is here to stay for the in foreseeable future, at least if there's stability in the region. And so there is little option to engage in behavior that will threaten India's security. That is quite clear. And I think Indian government, not the Indian civil society, Indian government has shared several symbolic messages that India is keen to recalibrate relationship with BNP. So during Khaleda Jia's funeral, we have seen the Indian foreign minister traveling to Dhaka and meet Tariq Rahman and shared India's condolence. We are going to see the Indian speaker joining the oath-taking ceremony. The Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi was very quick to congratulate BNP and Tariq Rahman after the election, which I thought was quite significant in the sense. But whether but Tariq Rahman and BNP, so far their public speeches have underpinned that they put Bangladesh's relationship first, Bangladesh's interests first. That means probably there would be much more critical negotiation about water sharing. And I would believe that there is no other reason not to believe that Tariq Rahman is not going to pursue India to send Sheikh Hasina back. Because if the BNP is also part of the July protest and movement. There were street fighters from the party who fought against police and also in alliance with other political parties, Jamaat and students. So they would like to see Sheikh Hasina return, but I think what India has given, the congratulatory message that Narendra Modi has shared, is also underpinned that it is probably ready to move away from Sheikh Hasina, because from Delhi, Sheikh Hasina released a speech, or at least a statement in Facebook. I have seen she asked to cancel or reject this quote unquote farcical election. But India's official position is quite different than what Sheikh Hasina has been speaking. So I think there are good intention in both sides, but also politics plays a role in there. Because after the visit of the foreign minister in Bangladesh, one of the Bangladeshi cricketer who was playing in India was sent back, and that kind of prompted the Bangladeshi government to take the decision not to send Bangladeshi cricket team to India. So I think there is both government, even though they may have good intention, they also have to balance the national sentiment there. So to summarize, one will see much more stable relationship That means much more bilateral engagement. Second is there would be much more communication between this government. That I can hope. To answer your second question, which I talked a bit in my previous statement, is that there are hundreds and thousands of people who support this party, Army League. So there needs to be some sort of mechanism that would, especially for those who did not commit crime against humanity, who did not shoot the students, who did not work in tandem with the law enforcement agencies as a private militia to forcefully disappear people, and who did not commit crime or corruption, they should be allowed to give political space for political expression. It is inclusion is fundamental value of democracy. So I think Bangladesh's next parliament needs to discuss that seriously. On that note, I would complete my statement at this moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mubasha. Before I ask a next question to Sarah, I want to remind everyone to please drop your questions into the Q&A box stating your name and affiliation, and we'll get to those very soon. For now, Sarah, you're an expert on the legal system and access to justice. The independence of the judiciary was significantly eroded under Sheikh Hasina, as we've discussed. Were there any improvements under the interim government, and what should the BNP prioritize when it comes to legal reform?
Thanks, Marguerite. Yes, definitely. The independence of the judiciary was grossly eroded under Sheikh Hasina and the Awami League in the last 15, 16 years. But it was, of course, already it's an issue that's been under threat under previous governments as well. And we have pretty much always seen politicized appointments and efforts to instrumentalize the judiciary to carry out political vendettas. It's not new. It didn't start in 2009. But it did get massively exacerbated. And the fact that, government was in office for so long meant that they could entrench many practices. So things were taken to a new level or a new depth, given the longevity of their rule. During the interim, with the onset of the interim government and following the uprising, the situation of the judiciary and the role of the judiciary was very central. In fact, I think it's the first time we've had previous uprisings in Bangladesh. We've never seen the judiciary being attacked in the way in which they were attacked and threatened on August the 5th and immediately thereafter. And part of that was, I think, this public entirely, unacceptable to attack, I think, but at the same time, it was this it's important to acknowledge that it was a manifestation of a kind of public rage for people who had seen the judiciary carrying out kind of orders almost blindly in many cases. But there are still many concerns, I think, remaining now. But before I come to that, I think we should flag that the efforts that were made during the interim government did have significant changes that have come in place. So the changes have been made in different ways. Some of it has been through ordinances, presidential ordinances made in the absence of parliament. Some of it has been through landmark judgments that the judiciary themselves have made during this period. And another set have come through the reform commissions, the proposals of the reform commissions, not only the Judicial Reform Commission, but several other commissions that dealt with the issue of judicial reforms relating to particular issues, and some of which have now gone forward in the July Charter as well. So in terms of the legislative initiatives, we saw a new ordinance on appointment of judges, which meant for the first time for the Supreme Court, you could look at the kind of credentials of people whose names were going up for appointment. They also had to go through a kind of process of scrutiny, which has never happened before. And we've seen some, really very good appointments coming through as a result. We also saw, very importantly, a decision by the Supreme Court on the issue of judicial independence, which then led to directives to set up a judicial secretariat. Now, this sounds kind of a bit administrative and boring, but it's actually extremely important because we've seen in the past, despite there being a mandate for separation of the judiciary from the executive, control over the lower judiciary in terms of their appointments, postings, transfers, all issues that really affect their ability to work independently remained with the government and with the law ministry. So now they will go to a judicial secretariat which will manage all of this. So that's a very, very big deal to have happened. And in a way, this is, we kind of understand how enormous it is because the promises for separation were there in the original constitution of 72, but the steps to implement it, the first big steps came, more than 20 years after the constitution. Now it's come another 20 years later. So these are big things, and much will have to be done. Another, I think, important change, another set of important changes is the legal changes that have come to acknowledge certain kinds of rights violations that were not dealt with by the judiciary because of lack of independence. Primarily, of course, the setting up of a commission on disappearances to look into that issue, the legislation and ordinance again to provide remedies for disappearances. You've also seen a rehauling of the legislation on the National Human Rights Commission and reconstitution of that. So again, issues that can be dealt with by other institutions, not only the judiciary. I think that's also relevant to looking at the issue of the role of the judiciary and its strength. Very important laws have come through under the IG on restricting police powers and arrests and detention and to remand people into police custody. Also laws around strengthening the rights of victims in cases of violence against women and on strengthening the role of the judiciary in delivering legal aid to the poor and to marginalized communities. So these are all really positive and progressive measures. Perhaps the biggest one, which has come through judicial decision-making, is around the caretaker government and striking down the constitutional amendments which got rid of the caretaker government and trying to put them back in place again. Again, these are all issues that are now going to get consolidated through whatever happens with the July Charter and the discussions that come in Parliament. But these are all important, I think, positive steps that we've seen. Now, the concerns, though, that remain, I guess, is in terms of what next, and how does the judiciary, to what extent will we see implementation of, two other important changes, I think, which I should mention that happen, absolutely critical about the role of the judiciary, is many cases, as I said, the judiciary is sort of used as weaponized to carry out kind of political vendettas against opposition. So there were thousands and thousands of cases against members of the then political opposition done by the previous regime. Many of these, thousands of cases, were withdrawn by the executive, but that meant it preempted the possibility of further judicial harassment in those cases if they had gone forward. We also saw that the judiciary, at least at the higher levels, was able to look into many cases kind of openly and fairly without having political pressure down there, on them not to take certain decisions. And we've seen people getting relief who couldn't have imagined it possible, people who'd been illegally detained earlier, subjected to vexatious and false cases and so on. But where we haven't seen the changes, and what that's worrying, one of the measures that was taken immediately post uprising was, there was this massive anger against judges, as I mentioned, and there's a big demand to take action against judges who were seen as very corrupt and very biased. And unfortunately, in the face of that pressure, several Supreme Court judges were asked, High Court judges were asked to step down or stop sitting. And several in the meantime have resigned. Some have been asked to leave their office, have been removed. Now, there was a need for vetting, for sure. But I think there are concerns in the way in which that process was done, because it was not that transparent, not that clear. And we've seen that some judges who had a real reputation for being effective have also been subjected to that process. The process was done through the establishment of the Supreme Judicial Council and through its operations. That I should have mentioned also was a positive step of having the Supreme Judicial Council being reconstituted and effective. But I think the process leaves some questions for us for the future, because it means that there's a lot of fear amongst the judiciary. Who will be targeted, how, when, and can the judges really operate if there's that kind of fear factor working with them? We also saw judges being targeted for giving bail to people. Mubashir already spoke about this earlier, about the kind of harassment people have faced for simply being members of the Awami League, not only in the higher leadership, but mid-level leadership. We've also seen supporters, people who are lawyers, journalists, somehow affiliated, associated with the Awami League, or seen as having shored up its rule for so long, being implicated falsely in cases to do with the July massacres and others, and also in various financial cases by the Anti-Corruption Commission and so on. Now, there is a real concern that in many of these cases, it's clear that there's no evidence against these people. some of the people weren't even physically here. They could not have possibly been involved in killing someone when they're not physically here, and yet cases against them are continuing. So I think there's a war, and so as I was saying, in some cases where judges have given bail in these situations, they've come under further attack. So I think this whole issue of how this is a big challenge for the new government now, that the interim government really did not get high marks, I think, on how they addressed this issue of justice in the ordinary courts and justice for July in the ordinary courts, and the use of the failure, I think, to address or take up a transitional justice approach to the situation we were in. As we're in a kind of second transition now, following this election, I think it's a massive opportunity for this government, particularly since it's headed by people, most of whom, if not all of whom, have been subjects of repression in the past and have been subjects of judicial harassment, seen themselves, facing multiple legal cases on their heads, which had no basis. Perhaps they will have that commitment to addressing this issue in a different kind of way. Of course, subject to many, prior preconditions that you don't, you don't, in that process of trying to do a transitional approach, reconciliation and healing and moving on, you don't in the meantime just forgive everybody for everything. You have to have accountability. You have to have acknowledgement. But we also have to see how we have a process of repair, given there are people with different political viewpoints in this country, and we have to respect that, I think.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I'm going to ask one last question to Tom before we move to Q&A, but just a reminder that the Q&A box is there. Please state your question, your name, and your affiliation, and we'd be more than happy to address as many questions as we can. But for now, Tom, what are the most immediate economic challenges facing the new government, and how much room does it realistically have to pursue difficult reforms while meeting the high expectations created by the transition?
Yeah, thanks, Marguerite. So, I mean, I think the economy is perhaps challenge number one, really, for the BNP. When Sheikh Hasina led the country, the economy was in a really poor state, and obviously the disruption of the July-August movement also, it certainly had an effect as well. The instability, the uncertainty. And I think, we tend to forget or maybe overlook just how important economic issues were in the movement against Sheikh Hasina. Certainly, there were many other issues as well that prompted people to rise up against her government. But I think economic issues were pretty fundamental as well. The interim government has done well to stabilize the economy. I think this is really one of its key achievements. We've seen foreign exchange reserves increase. Inflation has come down somewhat. It's still high. The banking system, which was in a terrible state because, Awami League cronies had sort of taken huge amounts of money out of the banking system and moved it offshore. It hasn't collapsed. And just that, alone, I think, that they were able to maintain trust in the banking system, in the economy, both domestically and internationally, I think was a key achievement. But where the interim government has struggled, I think, is in terms of attracting both domestic and international investment. And some of this is related to the fact that it is an interim government, that this is, not an elected government with a 5-year term. But the effect of that is that, economic growth has been sluggish, and the economy hasn't created enough jobs. And Bangladesh is a young country with many working age people, over 100,000 people sort of entering the workforce every month, I understand. So it's fundamental that the jobs are created for them to meet their aspirations. And I think any government that fails to do that is really going to struggle to stay in office. Corruption and extortion as well were major issues over the past 18 months, and particularly during sort of the pre-election period, and the perception that BNP members were engaged in extortion really, I think, played to the advantage of Jamaat, which managed to project this image of its party members as being cleaner, more honest. And so I think, taking steps to address that is going to be really important. It does seem like a very common grievance, among people. And that's really, I think, about sort of system design, right? Like taking out the opportunities for corruption and extortion to occur. And that can be like cutting red tape or automating procedures, shifting some interactions with the bureaucracy online. If the BNP can do a good job with the economy, it will make everything else easier for the government. It will help to create a level of stability to tackle the many other challenges that are there. But they are working in this fairly tight fiscal monetary space. To get inflation down, the central bank has kept interest rates very high. That has had an effect. And also Bangladesh's debt level is growing under Sheikh Hasina, to a lesser extent under previous governments. I mean, government took loans for projects, infrastructure projects in particular, initially, with interest-free periods, but now the interest is coming due on a lot of those projects. And so that's year by year increasing as a proportion, of the budget. And that's going to be a challenge to manage. And, both parties made quite significant promises on the campaign trail as to what they would do for people. And, that all has to be paid for. So I think it's going to be tricky for the BNP to work out its priorities, which promises it's able to implement and which ones might have to wait because of the kind of economic situation. But there are a range of other challenges beyond the economy. I mean, I think we didn't talk that much about sort of law and order. This is another common complaint that people have had over the past 18 months. And I think a lot of it comes down to the kind of state of the police force, which should be the sort of front line for maintaining rule of law, keeping people safe, making people feel safe. But the police force was, very politicized under the Awami League government. Although, as Sarah said, with judicial independence, this is not something that started under the Awami League government. It's been a perennial issue. But it's more that, the Awami League was in power for 15 years, that over time, the police force became more and more politicized and stacked with people who were affiliated with the party. And under the interim government, the trust in the police force just hasn't been there. It hasn't been rebuilt. And interim governments had to rely on the army to some extent to provide security. Army now, it wants to go back to the barracks. I think it's very happy the election is over so it can get its forces off the streets. But that means the BNP will have to work, to rebuild trust in the police force. One worrying phenomenon that we've seen on the sort of law and order stability front is the rise of mob violence. Mob killings have become increasingly common. And to some extent that reflects lack of trust in the, in the legal system and in the police to take action. But, we've also seen attacks on media outlets and cultural institutions just in December, quite recently, and the police were completely absent in terms of protecting these institutions. So it's going to be, the incoming government's going to have this challenge of balancing stability with the need to, allow people to exercise their fundamental rights, for example, the right to protest, but, while taking action to prevent, this phenomenon of mob violence. So it's going to be, quite a challenge. But I think on the economy, as I said, I think if they can manage it in a way that it creates jobs, that the economy is growing, that people feel like the government is delivering for them, addressing maybe inequality to some extent, it's a huge issue in Bangladesh as well, then it will reduce the pressure on the government on these other issues that they will also have to deal with.
Thank you, Tom. I'm very glad to see some questions coming in. I think what we've heard about is a picture of a country that's at a very pivotal moment with real expectations for change, but also significant uncertainty about how deep that change will run. We've discussed the political mood after the elections, the return of the BNP, the rise of Jamaat, as well as the implications for foreign policy, judicial reform, and economic stability. We've also touched on more sensitive questions about violence, rights, and the place of the Awami League in Bangladesh's future. The transition is clearly not at an end point, but the start of a demanding and potentially fragile process. With that, let's turn to some of the questions. I'd like to begin with one from Jude Perry at the Irish Foreign Ministry. And the question was, how should countries seek to engage with the new government following elections? Not sure who would like to take that. Tom, would you like to take that? Oh, Sarah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sure Tom can give a more rounded answer, but I was going to say on the issues I spoke about, I think the Irish government would be in a good place to start some discussions, particularly around this transitional justice approach, as I mentioned, to see how they can take forward some of the positive aspects of what the interim government did, as I mentioned, in terms of disappearance commission, the work that has to be done with that, strengthening that, making sure the Human Rights Commission can work effectively. But really importantly, taking this transitional justice approach, maybe the Irish government would be in a good place to do that, given their own historical experiences and so on, albeit in a much smaller scale. But I think that would be the really important conversation for us to be having, and I think any support we can get with that would be really helpful.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Are there other comments on that question? If not, I'll turn to the next. All right, we have a question here from Sebastian Durl at Save the Children. It's about the Rohingya refugees. The question is, how do you assess the situation of Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh being affected by the new government, especially in relation to the question of repatriation to Myanmar? And for those remaining in Bangladesh, will the new government change the policies on education for refugee children and livelihood opportunities for Rohingya adults? That's a big question. I'm not sure who would like to take that one. Tom, did you have anything to start us off with?
Yes, sure. I can speak to that quickly. What we've seen from BNP in particular during the campaign period on the Rohingya, I mean, it's been pretty limited. It hasn't been an issue really in the campaign, but international media have asked Tariq Rahman, about this, and he's restated the commitment to safe, voluntary, dignified repatriation, which is important, but also gone a little bit further and said the Rohingya should be allowed or will be allowed to stay as long as it's not safe for them to return. So it's a good kind of baseline. The party does have a policy on the Rohingya that was introduced in 2023, which goes a bit further in terms of encouraging Rohingya leadership in the camps, closing Basan Char, also in terms of dialogue between the Rakhine community and the Rohingya community, and some policies around education and employment as well. So at the moment, officially, Rohingya are not allowed to work except in very limited circumstances for the humanitarian organizations as paid volunteers. And I think, it's going to be very hard to sustain this policy in the years ahead, given the declining international funding. And so I think that's really important that there is a conversation with the new government early on about how they plan to manage the Rohingya response, and particularly around, as you said, livelihoods and education. Managing the politics of this within Bangladesh is going to be tricky. It's going to require sort of careful communication because there's a perception that allowing Rohingya to work at all in Bangladesh is a step towards integration. So, that basically they will integrate into the local community and won't return. And so it needs to be done in a careful way to avoid sending the message to Bangladeshi people that this is a step towards integration. Naturally, most people feel, I think, that the Rohingya should have been given sanctuary as they were, but also that Bangladesh has many other challenges, and can't really, is not really in a position to accept the Rohingya permanently. So I think it's going to be a difficult issue for the interim government to navigate, for the BNP government to navigate. But perhaps the fact that it didn't come up much in the election campaign is a positive in that it gives a little bit of space. It's not a priority, not at the front of mind for most people. So that could take a little bit of the pressure off, but it will have to be addressed. I think the current approach is not necessarily sustainable.
Thank you very much, Tom. Mubashir, there's a question that I would like to direct to you. It's from, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing the name, Ashika Nabi Chowdhury, who's a journalist and former press minister at the Bangladesh High Commission in London. And the question was, the allegations of persecution targeting journalists, the judiciary, secular voices, professionals, and minority communities not only continue, but according to many observers, intensified during the recent interim government. Large numbers of people remain in jail for months without trial. The BNP also has a documented history of similar practices when it was in power. Given this record, how can we realistically expect Bangladesh's situation to improve after BNP returns to government, especially when Jamaat now holds a strong position both in parliament and among sections of the public?
So, when the July uprising toppled Sheikh Hasina, she fled. Many of her party affiliates have fled, but the system she constructed carefully over the period of 17 years was still in place. So Dr. Muhammad Yunus, when he formed this interim government, he he got this state apparatus which were deeply embedded in the dark values of repression and stifling, with prevalent torture and even killing. So the system was there. We saw that in many cases that behavior of torture was practiced. I would disagree with the comment that many of the secular, quote unquote, secular voices were repressed, because, we don't really know who are we talking about. Some people call Bangladesh politics is very volatile and also toxic. One group will call someone secular and the other group will call the same group as fascist. So I don't want to go into the detail of that complexity and toxicity, but we have seen during this period that there were some repression to the people, as Sarapa also highlighted, and I also highlighted, but that in city is not that much of widespread the way it was during Hasina's period. So I think the utmost challenge for the new government, as also Sarapa highlighted in her last comment, would be to go through this case by case and see what happens. I could give you one example of a journalist called Anis Alamgir, who were a critic of interim government and who were supporter of Awami League. People perceive him in that way, and he was unpopular to many of the July uprising supporters. And he was first picked up, and then he was held. And after a few days, he was charged on corruption cases. So they pick people up first, and then they frame them after picking up in cases. So that is a repressive behavior which we saw under Sheikh Hasina's government. And that goes back to my original argument and my original proposition that how we could talk about July Charter if we do not address this institutional behavior which still are engaged in repression. So the part of his second question was, let me see if I can find it, was what was the part of his second part of his question, Margaret? Something related to Jamaat? Yeah, so he said BNP has a documented history of similar practices when it was in power, given, BNP was in power long time ago, back in 2004. I mean, that lot happened after that. They were, they also were hugely sufferer of this repressive regime. And I would just hope that things will move towards more reconciliatory approach and more human approach, because we should not reapply that same state, this authoritarian state that kills his own citizen, that was engineered by Sheikh Hasina, to see in future. So civil society needs to play a large role in there. And also I'm hoping that the new government would be much more human. But I would I would see what happens. Thank you.
Thank you, Mubashir. I'm going to ask one last question to Sarah. We've got about 5 minutes left, and we had a few questions about the July Charter, so I'm going to merge them. Sarah, the BNP has in the past been lukewarm on the July Charter and the referendum. So how sustainable are the reforms made by the interim government, especially the ordinances which will have to be approved by the new parliament? That's from Michael Page, UNDP, Bangladesh. And there was also a question about what the legal framework says if the July Charter is not implemented, from Jul Barua at MSF. Sarah, over to you.
Thanks. Yeah. I just wanted to add one sentence on the Rohingya point, though, which is the question about, education and livelihood opportunities for Rohingya refugees. I mean, again, I think that given many people in the incoming government had to spend the better part of the last 16, 17 years, not least the possible new prime minister, effectively as refugees in another country, I hope they will have a real understanding of what the Rohingya are experiencing. And I think it was true also we heard a lot of that rhetoric in the Awami League time also, that, we were refugees during the Liberation War, so we understand refugees. But I think we'd like to see some, I think that experience will be their very recent experience for people. I hope they can, translate that into some real action, because I think we do have to see how we can have some more transformative response to this entire generation, very young people also who are growing up in the Rohingya camps at the moment without any future. And again, this new demographic that is kind of driving politics at the moment, this new generation, if they have the chance, I think if the new government at least opens the opportunity for more people from outside the camps, Bangladeshis, to visit with young people inside the camps and give them the opportunity to come outside, that's the way we can, connect people to people and try and understand better how and why we must make a change there. I really do hope that will be one of the things that they will think about doing. Now, turning to your questions about the July Charter, sorry, before that, the ordinances. So many of the substance of the ordinances are not actually in the July Charter. I mean, there are some that have some intersection and some connection, but they're not directly there. The July Charter doesn't say anything about disappearances or Human Rights Commission or any of this stuff. But we have to hope that they will adopt many of them almost immediately. So there's a lot for this new parliament to do. Parliament / you will have questions about this. As many of us have questions about the Constitution Reform Assembly. But they're going to have two very big things to do. Normally quite enough for anyone to be a Constituent Assembly or Constitutional Reform, let alone being also Parliament at the same time. So we'll see how all that is going to work. But I think that we should see a commitment to many of the ordinances going forward. If they don't, they'll lapse. But I think that's also something that, people need to raise because there have been lots of changes in this year to a lot of legislation, actually, with a lot of ordinances. So I think that has to come forward. And there are also some that were on the anvil with the IG, but didn't make it past the post, which should have been done months ago. For example, there's a sexual harassment law. Other than, one significant political party which we've discussed, I don't see anyone should have any problem with that. It should make it across. The domestic violence law didn't make it past the post in the end. So some of those will be for consideration by them as well, because they're kind of ready to go. On the charter itself, I mean, there are a number of different options. Now that the BNP has such a massive majority, they could take the position that the existing constitution gives them the powers to make amendments any way they want with that 2/3 majority, and they could go down that route. It doesn't seem like, I mean, we've not heard anything about what's going to happen on that. Doesn't see, we don't know whether that's the position they'll take, but they have that option available to them. They could also take the position, which is clear from the Charter and even from the referendum, that to the extent they have dissented on a number of points, including around some aspects of the caretaker government and some aspects of the upper house, how that will be constituted and so on, as well as a number of issues where they've said constitutional reform isn't necessary on this. Legislative, the particular issues can be mandated through legislation. They don't need constitutional change. I think some of those they can argue out now in the months to come, and see whether they can, get whether the majority will coalesce around that or not. If the July, and there are many issues which are just barely outlined in the referendum, not even discussed in any detail, and it's not really possible for people who voted yes in the referendum to have understood what they meant. So, for example, even if you did all of the background reading for it, so for example, there's a commitment in the referendum saying, the third question about do you want expansion of rights? I guess everyone would say, yeah, I want expansion of rights, but which ones are they going to be? There's a little note that the National Consensus Commission prepared proposing certain changes, but didn't propose a lot of changes to a lot of things which, if we had a longer session today, we might all want to propose. And interestingly, they also still kept up this exclusion from fundamental rights for certain categories of people. So enemy aliens, those accused of crimes against humanity. Now, there's a very big question whether you should have that carve out on fundamental rights, even for someone who's accused of crimes against humanity. The international courts don't do that. Our new constitution, 2026 proposed constitutional reforms, as proposed by the National Consensus Commission, fortunately not detailed in the referendum and the charter, do suggest that there will be that exclusion. So there's a lot of room still for debate and argument about what should come through. And I think there's scope for public engagement. So even if some things in the July Charter, many things in the July Charter don't go through, I don't personally think Bangladesh is going to suffer a great deal because of that. There are some that would be helpful to go through and that may give us a more accountable governance in the future. But at the end of the day, the only thing that's going to give us that is a very engaged civic space, engaged citizenry, and a mobilized citizenry that understands their own rights. So I think, what Thomas was saying earlier about some of the priorities for us now being the economic issues, those are really, really urgent. So there's also a question, I think, for the incoming government about where is it going to spend its time. Is it going to spend 6 months parsing the finer points of constitutional reform? Because I'm not sure that we'll all look kindly on it if they do that. Or maybe they should be focusing a little bit more on urgent priority agendas, including the economy, but also stabilizing law and order. So dealing with like real world practical stuff. And some of the constitutional reform will be seen as a priority. I personally find it difficult to see that all 80 plus 47 constitutional reform recommendations out of the 80 plus that we have in the charter unnecessarily should be taking up the time of the incoming members of Parliament / Assembly.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I think that was almost a perfect note for us to end on. Thank you for the summary. And thank you all for joining us today. Thanks particularly to our speakers. Mubashir, I know it's late for you, so thanks for holding on. And thank you all for joining us. I do apologize that we weren't able to get to everyone's questions. If they're really burning, please don't hesitate to send them through to Crisis Group. Otherwise, I want to let everyone know the recording will be available on our website and on our YouTube channel. So thank you again for joining us today. Thank you to our speakers, and hope to see you next time.